Welcome to the Wayne Public Library's virtual author chat. My guest today is Neal Lipschutz. Neal is a longtime journalist. He is a former deputy editor in chief of the Wall Street Journal. He also previously served as the journal's ethics and standards editor, as well as the top editor at Dow Jones Newswire. In addition to his journalism work, his short fiction has appeared in a number of publications. No Right Way to Die is his first novel and the initial installment in a series of mysteries. Welcome, Neal. Please tell us a little more about yourself and your novel, No Right Way to Die.
Well, thank you very much for having me, and thanks to the Wayne Public Library for this. You summed up my long journalism career. I worked for more than 40 years in the newsrooms at Dow Jones Newswires and the Wall Street Journal, which are both part of the same company. And I retired a couple of years ago and have devoted myself since then to writing fiction. And as you say, my first novel, which was just recently published, is a suspense novel called No Right Way to Die. And it's always, of course, a little tricky to describe the plot of a suspense novel because you don't want to give away too much, but I'll give you a quick synopsis of it. The protagonist is a character called Scott Morgan. He's a 58-year-old successful management consultant. He lives in the affluent suburb of Scarsdale in Westchester County outside of New York City. And he is someone who's very proud of himself in that he's someone who has improved his economic and social status, having grown up in somewhat modest conditions in a sort of old Brooklyn neighborhood. And he and his wife Meredith have a 28-year-old daughter whose name is Sarah. And one evening, Sarah brings home to the family home in Scarsdale for dinner to introduce her parents to her boyfriend, who is a 55-year-old, at one point well-known novelist who for many decades hasn't done much in the creative field. And Scott is immediately suspicious of him, and his name is Ed Blouse. Partly the large age difference between Ed and his daughter Sarah, but also he thinks that Ed Blouse has become sort of a serial user of people, and he feels the need to sort of protect his daughter, who is certainly not asking for that. He launches his own sort of amateur investigation into Ed Blouse's background, which involves him in some ways going back to Brooklyn and confronting some historic trauma of his own that he's tried to move away from. And while he's doing this, a murder occurs in the Manhattan apartment where Sarah and Ed lives, and that changes everything. And Scott Morgan's quest now is to run a peculiar kind of investigation into the murder, his goal mainly being to make sure that no one with the last name of Morgan winds up being arrested in that case. And that's, essentially the synopsis. There's lots of other things going on, and hopefully it's both an entertaining and fast-paced read, but at the same time, I aspire to creating complicated or complex characters who often don't do what I think most people would consider the right thing under very stressful circumstances, and to explore some deeper questions, including how far a parent should go to protect an adult child.
And what motivated you to start writing the book? That's quite a switch from journalism to writing mystery.
Yeah, it's a big switch, and writing fiction is something I've wanted to do for a long time. You alluded to the fact that I had a few fiction short stories published over the years, but between professional responsibilities and family responsibilities, I never felt like I had a real chance, the time needed to really pursue fiction writing. And as I approached retirement, I felt that this was an excellent time to devote to something I wanted to do for a long time. And in my own mind, I viewed it as not so much a retirement in a traditional sense, but really switching from one sort of work to another. And I've, in the 2 years or so that I've been retired from journalism, I've tried to, be consistent in the writing.
Um, so in crafting the story, how did you balance the need for clues with the danger of making the mystery too easy to solve?
Yeah, and that's a great question, and something I thought about. What happens, I think, if what I was trying to do is successful, it's not so much about clues, even though there are certainly some developments that might point to one character or another as the possible murderer. It's more about who had motive and who had opportunity. And I believe there's, several or perhaps more than several characters in the novel who have both those things, and therefore I think it will keep a reader interested in that it hopefully is not obvious when there are those many options of someone who could have committed the crime.
Just kind of is part of the next question that I had for you about how did you develop your complex characters while keeping their motives hidden?
Yeah, it's, I mean, just to step back for a second, I've always sort of been interested and drawn to sort of what I, at least in my own mind, consider ambiguity and the ambiguity of human actions and how they can be variously interpreted. And I'm also think it's interesting in the book that when a murder occurs, obviously it's an incredibly stressful situation, and how those characters react, I think, is a reflection of the values that they brought into it before the crisis occurred. So it sometimes their motives aren't that hidden. Sometimes in Scott Morgan's case, his distinct dislike of Ed Blouse is sort of obvious from the minute he meets him. He's not shy about expressing that. So in that sense, it's not about hidden motives. It's about, as I say, kind of an ambiguity in some of the actions and how a very stressful situation makes the different characters respond.
Um, in terms of setting, you mentioned a few locations where the novel takes place. Can you discuss the role that setting played in creating atmosphere and enhancing the mystery for your novel, No Right Way to Die?
Yeah, I think my own view is that locale and setting are very important in novels generally. Certainly, I think in suspense/mystery novels as well. Um, so it really is a very kind of metropolitan New York setting, and I think that hopefully comes across to readers. And what I was very interested in too is that there's sort of people from the outer boroughs. There's action that takes place in Manhattan, both corporate and in the apartment where Sarah and Ed Blouse lives. And then there's the Scott and Meredith living in the affluent suburb of Scarsdale. All these places are within reasonably short distances from each other, and yet their atmospheres, and I hope it comes across in the scenes that are set in different places, are very, very different. The comfort level of the characters in these different places is different. So I do think setting and trying to create an atmosphere is important. And one of the ones I was trying to create is how, and this is obviously just one slice of New York. New York is such a big and diverse place. This is just a slice of it. But even within this little fictional slice, my idea was to show, how different life can be in sort of this old Brooklyn neighborhood compared to Scarsdale, compared to the Chelsea neighborhood of Manhattan.
Um, is No Right Way to Die part of a series? Is that what your plans are?
Yes, it's the first in a series, and I think it's interesting because I think if one reads the book, it might not seem obvious from the way it ends, how it becomes a series, but I hope I've managed that. It is the first in a series, and I'm excited about that. And one of the reasons I'm excited about it is, when you're talking about my transition to writing fiction, writing in general, certainly when you're writing novels, is a pretty lonely enterprise, and or I should say, a solo enterprise for much of it. And I, the characters become real in some ways to the author, or certainly fully imagined, I believe, is probably a much more better way to say that. And the fact that I'll be able to write, and am writing a second novel that includes some, not all of the characters, is exciting because I can get to see what happens to these fictional characters when they're put in new stressful situations, and also what have they learned and how have they changed from everything that's happened in No Right Way to Die.
Are you currently working on the second novel in the series?
Yes, I'm on a very high number of drafts into it. I'm hoping to be finished quite soon. Um, but I've been working on it for a while, and I think I need to go through it a couple more times to try to just make it a little better and tighter. But it's close. It's close to being finished.
And what is your writing process from idea to finished manuscript?
Yeah, it varies a little bit, I think, from the first novel to now the subsequent novels, because in addition to trying to finish the number two book in what will be a series, I've also written and I'm still working on and kind of polishing a completely different mystery suspense novel that takes place on a Greek island that has nothing to do with any of these characters, whole different set of characters. So each book's been a little different. One of the things I learned, since I'm a novice to a lot of this, and learning as I go. I've done a lot of reading about the craft and reading both books, and also there are so many newsletters and podcasts about writing and the various aspects of publishing. And one of the things that keeps coming up again and again is this, especially when you're talking about genre novels, I think, like suspense and mystery, that are plot driven to a significant degree. There's some dichotomy that people talk about between so-called pantsers and plotters. The pantsers being people who go by the seat of their pants, just start with a character or an idea, and the plotters on the other extreme, being meticulous in my imagination of everything they do. And I'm somewhere in the middle. I do start with an outline. The outline isn't very detailed, and as I write and I add things and drop things, the outline changes. Some of it becomes obsolete. Even as I'm writing, I'm also then going back and trying to fill out and keep the outline as current as I can. And sometimes that doesn't actually work out. So my process is that it's a little bit of flexibility, which is important to me. So both outline and just plowing ahead, and sometimes the writing just takes you in a different direction. The other thing, at least for me, that's important about process is that to go after it every day, to try as much as possible. Obviously, you know, I don't want to completely isolate myself, and I do enjoy meeting people for lunch and seeing friends and family and children and grandchildren, which I enjoy immensely. But when those things aren't going on, I do want to look at it as this is my job. So every day I'm going to go and work at it, even if no one other than myself cares whether I do or not. So I think, again, speaking just for myself, because I think everyone is different, I think that discipline is important part of my process.
And in terms of the craft elements, um, do you find that one part of it is your strong suit, and another part might be something that you want to try and improve on as time goes by.
Yeah, I mean, I'd honestly like to improve on everything, and I keep kind of working on trying to get there. But to answer your question more specifically, I think I'm reasonably strong, I hope, on creating characters that feel not so necessarily real, because I want the reader to suspend disbelief. So they don't have to be real, but they feel, kind of credible in a way that makes you, whether they're likable or not, you still feel that they're people that you can in some way, fictional people that in some way you can relate to. So I think that's reasonably strong. I think this novel helped me a lot getting better at action and continuing action. There's one thing that, of all the writing advice that I've read, one thing that stuck in my mind, and I did repeat to myself as I was writing No Right Way to Die, I believe comes from the writer George Saunders, who's, very well known and terrific short story writer and novelist. And I hope I'm getting the quote right, but I think he said, always be accelerating. And I think by that he meant not necessarily action in the sense of, car chases or things, but increasing tension, always increasing sort of the stakes of the story. And so I've tried to keep that in mind. So I think I've gotten better at that. The area that I think is a challenge to me, and some of it is just because I don't know how much of it I really want to do, is in descriptive writing, describing a house, describing a place, describing people. And part of that is, I do think, again, I've been a voracious reader my whole life, and some of the books that I've liked best, in my mind, have left space for the reader, for the reader to sort of imagine what this character looks like. Doesn't go into great detail. Imagine what their house looks like to a large degree. So I want to set some parameters about the person's physical appearance, the house's physical appearance, a natural scene's physical appearance, but I don't want to do too much. I want to let the reader bring her or his own view to it. But I think I could get better at that for sure, figuring out how much description and making sure the description is, well done.
Um, have you struggled with writer's block? And if so, how have you stayed motivated to continue on to finish the book?
That hasn't been an issue for me. And I think part of it is because I've had this pent up desire to do this for a while. Um, there's no doubt that certain days, the writing, or if I'm in an editing phase or a revision phase, goes better in my view, or goes easier than other days. And that goes back to what I said earlier, why I think the consistency, at least for me, is important, to put in my 5 hours or 6 hours every day. um, some days are going to be more productive than others. So I think that, again, for me, that discipline of trying to get at it as much daily as possible is important. But I really haven't had an issue about, oh my God, I can't think of anything to write here. Again, I'm hoping that the ideas keep coming. And I do think part of it is because I have wanted to do it for a while, and am really, feel very fortunate to have the opportunity, and want to take advantage of it.
Have you heard from your readers? And is there any memorable reader encounter that you can share with us?
I I mean, I've had some feedback, and it's been generally positive, which has been very nice to hear. I was on a podcast a few weeks ago, and the podcast host had read the book and said he liked it, and said that he read it in one sitting. And I thought that, well, that's pretty good. If you like the book enough, or you wanted to find out what happens next enough to plow through it in one sitting, I figured that's a pretty positive review in its own right.
It is a very positive review, to be
Mhm.
honest. Although it must be a little frustrating as you know how long it took you to write the book. So,
Yeah, true. But I did try to keep it short, so I mean, it would take a while, but it's manageable in one sitting, probably.
um, can you share with us what your publishing journey was? Did you choose traditional publishing or self-publishing, and what made you decide on that route?
Yeah, so I'm working with a small independent publishing company. So it's traditional publishing, but it's a very small company, really run just by two individuals. And so that's been my only experience to date since this is my first novel, but it's been very positive, but because it's small and because it's only two principals, communicating when you need to is very easy and straightforward. And I also received a very strong and helpful edit of the book, and which I think, without doubt in my mind, made it a stronger book. And that, was extremely valuable and not necessarily, something that you can have guaranteed. So I think that the whole experience has been positive. The editing made it a better book. So, so far, so good.
Who's your publisher?
Oh, the publishing company is called Tucker DS Press, and they have a distribution agreement with Simon and Schuster. But it's a small publishing company, and it's called Tucker DS Press.
Um, and what would you say is the hardest part, was the hardest part of publishing for you?
I think the hardest part, and it's coming into, that I have this agreement, that hopefully, if everything works out, that the second book in the series will be published in July of next year. I think the hardest part is just sort of how long things take. In journalism, and for many, many years, most of my career, 30 of the 40 years roughly, I worked for a news wire, where you were publishing instantaneously. And then when I worked at the Wall Street Journal, usually, obviously, there was a different publishing sort of schedule, but soon after something is ready for publication in journalism, it usually gets published. Here, months and months go by when everything is set, and then you try to get sort of pre-publication date publicity. You try to send out, various review copies, all this other kind of thing. So the scheduling, it just takes, it's just a much lengthier process. And I think it's taken me some getting used to that, because that's very different than my previous experience.
Um, Most authors that I speak with will tell me that the hardest part, after the book is published, is marketing and promotion. What has your experience been like with that?
Yeah, I mean, I can certainly see that. I mean, I think that someone who is interested in writing and wants to write, and as I said before, if you're interested in writing, it means sitting alone in a room somewhere, or even in a coffee shop surrounded by people, but in your own little world, especially if you're writing fiction, in your own fictional world. And then all of a sudden you have this book, which is great. And really probably the ultimate dream of every writer, to get their book published. And then you have to go out in the world and try to promote it. So I think it's challenging and may not be the first and most natural instinct of some writers, but and also I think it's daunting because, as so many books are published week in and week out, by the big publishing companies, by the independent publishing companies, self-publishing being such a big part of the market now. So it's a challenge to get anyone to even understand that this book is out and what it's about and why it might be of interest to them. But I've found it so far, the actual acts of promoting and being on podcasts, having conversations like the one we're having now, has been quite enjoyable, and has been always interesting, and you get to meet interesting people, and it's been, generally a very positive experience. But it is, obviously, especially with a first novel in a small publishing company, it's, it's difficult to just get the word out, but it's been to the degree I've had conversations during this attempt to promote the book, it's all been very positive.
What advice would you give a new author, a new writer that's just starting out?
Yeah, I think I'd say a couple of things. One is, if it's really something you want to do, just persevere. I think it's a um, difficult craft to begin with. I believe to write a book length anything, whether it's fiction, genre fiction, literary fiction, or certainly nonfiction, and all the research that has to go into nonfiction, and reporting and all the rest. So I would just say, if it's important to you, persevere. I think it's at least for me, and I would imagine for anyone else, to try to do it regularly. Obviously, lots of people have family obligations and career obligations and have to make a living outside of writing, so they can't write every day, but just to be committed to it and to persevere, and perhaps try to separate the process from the eventuality of hoping for publication. The whole system of trying to, in traditional publishing, certainly trying to find an agent, trying to find directly a publisher, is such a competitive world in its own right, with its own rules and its own processes. I think if you're concerned about writing, it's best to really concentrate on the writing, and think about, make sure that everything is really complete to the best of your ability before you take the next step to think about publishing, and try to enjoy the writing. If that's really what drives you, the process of writing, to get your ideas, to get your thoughts, to get your feelings into some fictional form, then do that. The other thing I would say, for what it's worth, is to, writing is like anything else. You want to get better at it. And one way to get better at it, I think, is, let's say you've written a short story, it's early on in your attempts to write, set it aside for a while, come back 2 weeks later, come back a month later, try to look at it critically, try to look at it uh, in a way that you're actually looking for flaws, looking for ways that you can make it a stronger, tighter, more compelling story, regardless of what the subject matter is. So I think once you get a little bit of that distance, and then you come back and you say, gee, this could be, because I think, at least again, speaking from personal experience, when you're writing the first draft of something, or even a second or a subsequent draft, while you're doing it, it seems, yeah, this is pretty good. And it's only when you come back and look at it critically, that you can see, I think, the places where it needs to be improved. So, if you want to get better, I believe you've got to come back and look at things critically. I know a lot of people, I haven't done this, but a lot of people like joining writing groups where people exchange chapters and critique, their partners or the other writers in the group critique each other's work. And some people find that very helpful. So, one way or the other, I think, take it seriously, try to do it regularly, and then try to get better by reviewing and accepting, or thinking at least about criticism, if other people are offering constructive criticism.
So I have one more question for you.
Okay.
I tend to end on a slightly fun question. So if you could have dinner with one of your characters, who would it be and why?
Yeah, that is an interesting question. I think I would go with Scott Morgan, because he's such a he's he's very clever. He's very always looking out for his own interests, and he's always sort of gaming a situation. So I think to have dinner with him would be interesting, to sort of see how he reacts in conversation, to see how he takes on any new subject of conversation, or whether or not you can get past what I imagine he would do, which is sort of the superficial repartee, and get through that and get to sort of what was really going on with that character beneath the surface. In the book itself, there is a lot of interiority of Scott. You know, we do get to see a lot of his thoughts, what he's thinking and how he's gauging different situations. And I think during a dinner with him, you would want to try to, again, get past his surface and see what he's really thinking, because he's a, complicated and not always admirable, but I think interesting person.
I will let everyone attending here, and when the video goes live next month, September, Neal will be here at the Wayne Public Library on Saturday, September 13th, and he is going to do a writer's workshop for us. As you mentioned a few minutes ago, writers groups, we just established one here at the library, and Neal has generously agreed to come and talk to hopefully some of the members of that and some of our patrons about what it was like to switch from journalism to suspense novels. So thank you, Neal, for being here this evening and talking to us about your novel, No Right Way to Die. And we wish you all the best of luck. And I look forward to meeting you in person next month. Thank you again for being here this evening.
Well, thank you very much. I've enjoyed the conversation and look forward to meeting you next month as well.